So, hello everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sesha Mani. I'm a senior program manager with Identity and Access Management Platform team at Microsoft. And first of all, thank you all for taking the time to come and see this presentation today. To start off with, how many of you actually are SharePoint developers? Quite a few. A lot of them. Thank you. So this session is mainly about how SharePoint 2010 was built using Windows Identity Foundation. How are the identity features within SharePoint 2010 was built using what we call WIF. This is more like a case study. Like we have been using, it's almost like 2 to 3 years of project that we have done. And I'm actually very honored to be here to present how we did it, what our design and architectures that we followed, what we learned, what hard lessons we learned from this project, and so on. Okay. So the agenda for the session is, first of all, we'll spend a few minutes on what are the identity challenges we had in SharePoint 2007. That set the level set for why did we choose to go to claims-based identity model, and how WIF features enabled us, SharePoint 2010, to be able to resolve those challenges. And then focus mainly on SharePoint 2010's architecture, the identity architecture. So how the claims is part of SharePoint itself. Okay? And then also, more importantly, as I go through this, how we did for SharePoint 2010, I also wanted to make sure your scenarios, your applications, how they can make or do the same thing in your to satisfy your, to basically resolve the challenges that you have in your applications today. Okay, that's the major goal. So when you walk out of this room today, I want you to be able to feel that now I understand how WIF can be used to solve my identity-specific issues in my applications. So first of all, the challenges. So how many of you are very familiar with SharePoint 2007 and what are the challenges? Quite a few. Okay. So authentication today is intertwined within SharePoint 2007. So literally, we have some code within the SharePoint 2007 if you want to write. If authenticated by Windows Integrated Auth, do such things. If it is by forms-based auth, do such things, right? So that's the first particular challenge. Now, in the long run, it's hard to maintain the code if you're having authentication-specific things within the application. So for example, there are regulations coming in, for example, FFIEC coming in saying, hey, you need to start doing stronger authentication for your application, right? So now you need to go back to your application, figure out how am I going to do this? Is it going to change my application logic or not? So having authentication logics within the application is a long term. It's going to be complicated and hard to maintain. The second major challenge is configuring for identity delegation. So as you know, the SharePoint is more like typical 3 hubs application. So you have a web front end, you have a backend service, and then all the way at the back end, you have some databases where the content is getting retrieved from. So today, to be able to give the user identity, today actually we have service identity. That's what all the way goes back. But to configure it so that you can delegate the user identity as well at the back end, you need to go through the complex setup of constraint delegation so that and the trusted subscription model to allow the user and service identity be available for the backend services. The third major challenge is in terms of access control, right? All these specific roles that you have access to within the SharePoint, if you think about it, they all either come from as Active Directory attributes or from you have your own role providers where you fetch in the user profiles out of it. But there isn't a way that you can specify, for example, a CRM role that I wanted to be able to get within SharePoint and being able to authorize based on that particular role. There isn't a specific way to do it. Although SharePoint itself, within the SharePoint itself, like you can have item level access checks and also, those are all granularly available. But what you are accessing against, the roles that you're accessing against, is limited to what the available attribute stores are, like Active Directory and role providers. So those are the top 3 challenges that I want to highlight that we saw. Now, specifically, are these challenges specific only to SharePoint 2007? How many of you here have the exact same problem? Like identity delegation. Right, so many of the applications have the exact same problem, right? You have to configure the complex configuration. Access control is very limited based on what you have available in Active Directory and the other role providers. Authentication is intertwined within the applications itself. So what is the solution for this, and what do we need to do to resolve these challenges? Well, we have to step up to these challenges and figure out what's the right solution for it. And we did. And that's what the new path in identity in SharePoint 2010, which is claims-based identity. Kim had a keynote session on this earlier on Tuesday, highlighting how other partners have actually used WIF, and he has gone through how the claims-based identity is the next generation for the identity path to take. How many of you have actually gone through like Victoria's session on WIF so that you have enough video? Quite a few, thank you. Okay, so what I will do is let's go through the flow today that that exists in SharePoint 2007, and then contrast that with how it changed in SharePoint 2010. So as you see, it's a 3-hop application. So you have a SharePoint web application, and that's where all the authentication methods, logics, as well as what resources are getting displayed. And then you have SharePoint service applications, such as like Excel services or Visio services or project services. And then you have on the back end the content database where all these resources are getting stored. So with respect to the authentication methods, several methods, right? Windows Integrated Auth, ASP.NET, membership and role provider auth, and then the web SSO. Those are the top 3 authentication methods that are available for you today. And then from the access control standpoint, we have roles-based access control as well as trusted subsystem model you can use, or you can also configure it as an anonymous access too. And then on the shared services standpoint, there's a shared services framework that you can, all the services are built on top of. Typically, it uses Windows Identity as of today. So what we did in SharePoint 2010 is we introduced using WIF in a SharePoint STS. So every installation of SharePoint, any application, web front-end server that you install, it actually comes with an STS in it. Okay? All the applications that you configure are actually trusting that STS. Okay? So with the WIF, we introduced the SharePoint STS, and establishing the trust from the SharePoint applications to that STS, what we did was we externalized the authentication to that STS. In yesterday's presentation, Victoria made a good story on how today bartender, if you go to the bar and present your driver's license, you are able to, now the guy is saying, yes, I trust this driver's license, and I will give you a drink, right? So what we did was that's kind of applied the same logic here, saying we externalize authentication and we trust that SharePoint STS, right? Within the application, there is no authentication specific things. All it knows about is claims. It's all claims-based identity within the application. So as you can see, we externalize all the authentications and trust the STS. Whatever the claims that are issued by the STS is what we will use within the application. The second major change is on the access control aspect. Again, based on the claims identity that comes in, we were able to protect the resources just based on claims alone. So there is no, it's automatic identity delegation now is available for you. So you have both user identity and the service identity available at the access control level at the backend services too. The third major one on the services application framework, we basically enabled that with the WIF, and that allows us basically make sure of claims awareness. So we created that as well as part of claims-based identity. So as you can see, all the way from the front end all the way to the back end, everything is now claims-based. It's all talking in the same single model across the hops. Okay, but it's not enough to say, reality, there are at the backend services that still are non-claims aware that requires Windows identity. So for example, if you have a SQL database at the backend, you should be able, we need to be able to go and retrieve data out of the SQL database. So for that, you just have to have access to the Windows identity. So I'll explain to you how we actually achieve that too. Okay. So on a high level, these are all the 3 major categories that we actually modified with the WIF so that we get a single claims-based model across SharePoint 2010. So first of all, what are the benefits by going through this claims-based model? Why did we actually choose to do this model? First, the existing infrastructure, identity infrastructure, for example, Active Directory or LDAP, where you have your user accounts, you can still carry forward and using them in this claims-based model as well. Okay. So we are preserving whatever was there in the SharePoint 2007. The second one is, which we have got enough, like a lot of feedback from your customers, is being able to use a single URL, single SharePoint web application URL, at the same time support multiple authentications. Okay, so let's say I have myapp.com and I want to be able to authenticate either through Windows Auth or Forms authentication, depending on, let's say, where I'm coming from. If I am within the CARPnet, I will use Windows Auth. If I'm coming from outside, I want to be able to use Forms Auth or any other federated auth. Now, today it is possible. You can do like zone specific. You can go through intranet and extranet. But within just single URL, how you do it is what this claims-based model allows us to do. Because now we just externalize to the STS, and the STS will take care of all the authentication. If I have to introduce new authentication method to a SharePoint web application because of some compliances reports, the compliance that I need to go through, you can basically add that on the STS itself, matter of adding additional authentication on the STS, because from a SharePoint standpoint, it expects claims-based identity. That's all it expects. That's the major benefit that we got. The third major one, like a third one, is enabling automatic and secure identity delegation, so that both the user identity and the service identity that is available in the front end is now propagated to the backend services as well, so that the backend services can make more knowledgeable decisions and then return the appropriate results. Okay? And as I said, all the way from front end to the back end is all claims-based. There is no real credentials being asked again. It's like a single sign-on all the way under the back end. And in fact, even after the back end services, let's say there's an external service that is claims aware, that is SAML aware, then you will be able to forward this along the same token and then being able to retrieve the external services data as well and display it in SharePoint. I'll show you a demo as well of that. So last but not least, now everything is all standards-based across the board. So WIF is based on the WS star standards and SAML specific standards too. So what that gives us for SharePoint is also now standards-based, and any SAML-aware applications or services now being able to use the SharePoint or being displayed their content within SharePoint itself. So those are the major benefits that we see out of the SharePoint 2010 by going through the claims-based model. Now, how did we achieve this? So Windows Identity Foundation. So that's where we basically moved all of our identity foundation to be based on Windows Identity Foundation itself. That's a fundamental shift that we made. And just a quick overview, the Windows Identity Foundation is basically an extension to the .NET framework that allows you to build claims-aware applications and security token services. And also, as I said earlier, this is mainly all standards-based and is also interoperable, so that you will be able to now extend your applications to all the other third-party applications that you never thought you can easily extend it so easily. The third major is targets both ASP.NET and WCF developers. So how many of you here are ASP.NET developers? And how about WCF? Okay, that's great. So we have both targeted the ASP.NET and the WCF developers. And the most important thing is the foundation gives you unified programming model for both the audience. So literally, you can write whatever identity you're getting out of the ASP.NET and then use the same kind of code within the WCF itself. Okay? I'm not going to go very detailed into that because already Victoria has covered that in the WIF overview session, but I just wanted to recap what WIF is. So in this session, I'll focus on basically three major themes because we have learned a lot in the past 2-3 years integration project in SharePoint. And I was thinking about what's the best way to share those information with you. And then I thought, well, it's actually better to talk about what are the three major challenges I had mentioned before, and contrast that with the themes that are important for you. Okay. First theme is mainly externalizing authentication. So as I said, this is like how the identity is coming into the SharePoint, how you get authenticated and get access inside the SharePoint. So that's why I call it identity into the SharePoint. The second major theme is identity normalized. So within the SharePoint, as inside the SharePoint, how the identity is being used, as well as when it goes outside of SharePoint, like you can talk to an external service that is also be capable of understanding claims, how it is being normalized. The third major theme is supporting the existing infrastructure. As I said earlier, everything is great, everything is claims aware, everything is beautiful. However, that's not reality. We still need to support the existing infrastructure. So how would we be able to do that? So those are the three major themes that I will go in deeper. Okay. So the first theme is externalizing the authentication. So as I said earlier, each SharePoint web application is now able to trust the SharePoint STS that is getting installed as part of the installation within the web front-end server. And all the applications, if you go ahead and create, let's say, 10 different SharePoint applications, now you'll be able to, those are all trust that particular STS only. So for example, aware of in a SharePoint form, so you can have multiple missions within the form, and you have the STS available in each mission so that all the applications can use those STS. What that means is each STS share the same certificates that it uses for signing the token and also on. So that's one concept that I want to call it out. As we go to the specific to the methods. So in SharePoint 2007, we had three major methods: Windows Integrated, ASP.NET, and Web SSO. With this SharePoint 2010 model on claims-based, we basically are still having what we call a classic method, meaning if you migrate from SharePoint 2007 to 2010, you still are going to go through this classic mode, what we call, and then have the Windows identity available throughout the application. So your application will continue to work. On the other hand, we introduce a set of three claims-based authentication methods. And let me give you an example. What the differences are here are the Windows claims and the Windows classics. The main difference is when you come through Windows claims authentication method, you are basically getting a claims-based identity. So within your application, you have access to all the claims that the STS issued. When you come to the Windows Classic authentication method, you are still using Windows identity. There's no claims identity available at that point for you. That's the major difference between these two. Okay? And then I have the ASP.NET, what we call FBA, Forms-Based Authentication Claims Mode. So in which case, when you are authenticating against your membership provider, ultimately you will get authenticated on the STS. You get back the SAML token that has the claims in it, which are nothing but your roles. All the roles that are available in your role provider will become as claims and will be made as the claims-based identity and available for your application. The third one is more like an extension that we were able to get by just going into the claims-based model. Now we are able to accept any SAML token, any other federated identity providers that are out there. We can accept tokens, SAML tokens from those identity providers, and then convert that into a SharePoint-specific token, use that as a claims-based identity within SharePoint Web App. That's the extension now we are able to get by just moving into a standard-based model. So now you can see, as you can see, the identity is more condensed and normalized as a claims-based identity. And within the SharePoint, especially when you get inside the SharePoint, now you are able to get into with the claims-based identity model. And many of you are aware of the SP user object within the SharePoint now that has a collection of claims that are available so that you can make use of them for personalizing your application or creating your own web parts. You can make use of those claims for those. And let me give you a high, 1,000-foot view on what happens behind the scenes, right? So let's say the user, Frank Miller, is trying to access a SharePoint web application. And as I said earlier, the web application has a trust with the SharePoint STS. So the user is trying to access the web app. Based on what authentication method configured for your web application, he will get redirected to the STS saying he's authenticated, his application is now configured for Windows Integrated Auth. So the STS will basically authenticate the user based on Windows Integrated Auth. And when you're authenticated with Windows Integrated Auth, and as you know, it makes the group sets and primary sets are available for you. So all the sets will become as claims, right? And that's what the STS will put as claims within this token. But not only that, this is another cool part. You can augment any additional claims as part of the token. So this is what I was telling earlier. One of the challenges we have in SharePoint 2010 today is that you won't be able to just add in additional roles from your CRM database, for example, within your identity so that you can use that within SharePoint. But now, with this augment claims functionality, you would be able to add additional claims. And then those claims will become available for you throughout your SharePoint application, and you can make decisions based on those claims. So based on the authentication claims and whatever claims that you augmented, SharePoint STS gives a token back. I'm calling it as a SharePoint token. And the web application that receives it, so the WF piece of it will decode the token and make the claims, extract the claims from the token, and then make it available as an iClaims principal for the application. So now that's how the end-to-end flow would work behind the scenes. Okay. Let me go into a little bit even deeper, 50-foot view. Okay. So when the user, there are two aspects that you're aware of, Windows authentication and cookie authentication. With the SharePoint 2010, what we did was moving into the WF model, we have federated authentication module and session authentication module. And federated authentication module is more like, it basically understands the WS federation. It can serialize and deserialize the WS federation specific protocol aspects. That's why we call it WS federation authentication module. And the session authentication module is the one that takes care of the session management, as the name implies. So when the user, before I go to the flow, one other piece that I mentioned was SharePoint STS. So how is it built, right? It is built on top of WF. So WF as a service, a class called Security Token Service, and SharePoint STS is derived off of that service, and it's called SharePoint Security Token Service. So that's a class available. And then the WS Federation serializer that I'm calling out here is part of WF. So that takes care of all the protocol heavy lifting so that the SharePoint STS focuses just on claims. What claims do I need to give this to application? That's all it cares about. But these are the inner components that are available so that you know how the flow works under the hood. So user accesses the application. The first thing will happen is the session authentication module comes in the first thing that hit, and it figures out, is there a cookie available in the request? And if there is no cookie available, since there is no cookie, it's going to redirect them to let the WS Federation module do its job, which is it's going to figure out who the STS that I trust, right? So the application is configured with the trusted STS. So it's going to figure out who the STS is and redirect the user to the STS. The STS will then understand that WS Federation request that comes in and then figures out, okay, issue a token for this one. Here is the identifier for this application, issue a token for this particular application. The step 6 is security token service then issues a token for that particular application. The serializer will then figure out, put that into a WS Federation response message, and then forwards that into the application, which in turn, the Federation module will take a look at it and say, okay, now I got the response, let me decode it, and what are the claims available, I will extract it, and then make it as iClaims principal that is available for the application. So that's the end-to-end flow. Then, finally, before it gets get back to the actual application code, it actually says, here is the cookie that I'm creating it for this particular request, so that any subsequent requests go through number 1 and 2 again. It has the cookie now, so session auth module will skip step number 4 and 5. It will just say, okay, I have the cookie, let the user in. Okay. That's the under the hood how the end-to-end flow will work between the SharePoint web app and the SharePoint STS. All right, so let me go ahead and going to switch to the demo mode here. So I have a setup with a domain controller, a SharePoint application server, and a client. Okay, and I'm going to show you within the SharePoint application server what are the applications, how you configure the application with multiple authentication methods, and how you configure with these specific claims itself. For example, I have a HR application. And if you look at the authentication providers that I have configured, so here I have enabled with this for Windows authentication. So before I go there, there are three, as I said, there are three major authentication methods that are available for you in the claims mode: Windows Integrated Auth, ASP.NET Membership and Role Provider, and the third one, which is the Federated Identity Provider. And as you said, like, you can select multiple authentications per application here. So the behavior would be, if you select multiple authentications, when the user hits the application, he will have to select which authentication method he would want to use. Or you can make that sign-in page smart enough and figure out how they are coming from, whether they're coming from intranet or extranet, and then choose, you can redirect them accordingly. You can configure that automatically as well. So I have configured this app with the Windows authentication, and let me go into the details on, so this is my app. And let me open up the config file for that particular application itself. And then you can see where the session authentication module and the federated authentication module are configured. So here is where it is in the HTTP modules. As you can see, there are two federated authentication and the session authentication module are configured. And one thing I want to call out here is in SharePoint, what we actually extended what was available in WIF in order to do specific SharePoint-specific things. So for example, as you see here, it's a SharePoint identity model.sp federated authentication module, which is deriving off of the WIF's federation authentication module. And this particular module, there are additional SharePoint logics, like based on the client who's talking to the SharePoint, because SharePoint has browser clients, active clients, or some tools like SharePoint Designer as well that comes in. So based on that, we need to do some specific redirects. So because of those logics, we actually extended the federation authentication module, and we created the SP federation authentication module. And same goes true for the SP session auth module as well. But the underlying, all the protocol heavy lifting is all done by the WIF's federated authentication module and the session authentication module. Let me go back into the IIS again. So now, where is the STS, right? I have shown the application, and the application has the modules plugged in, so I understand it's all goes through fine. Now, the STS within this particular, as I said, for each machine, there is an STS involved. So as you can see right here, Security Token Service application. So it gets installed as part of your web front-end installation itself. So let me go ahead. Now the next question is, what are the claims that the SharePoint STS is issuing for the application, so that the application can decide how to use those claims and figure out what are the specific personalization that I wanted to make. So let me go ahead here. So I have the same application that I showed you, the human resources team side. So I'm going to retrieve or enumerate all the claims that the SharePoint STS issued for this application. As I said earlier, this is using WIF's the iClaims principle and the iClaims identity extensions, and being able to retrieve or enumerate all the claims that were issued by the STS. So here you can see all the claims that came from the SharePoint STS. And the important one that I want to call out here is the form ID. So this form ID claim tells me for the application that this belongs to the STS of that particular form. And the application knows which form that it is running under. So it uses that form as well. Now, on the other hand, when it goes to the backend services, right, to be able to determine which form the STS in which form is actually issued the token, this is also information for the backend services too. So this form ID flows through the hubs and then can be used by apps and the services to determine which STS actually issued it. On top of, there are other WIF-specific STS, like signing certs and stuff that is being done. But this is for a SharePoint-specific claim that is being used. Okay. Let me go back. So this is the list of claims that are available, and I'm going to let me enable the application with multiple authentications now, and then try to hit the application again. So while it's saving it, let me go ahead, close it and open a new one. Okay, it's still saving it, so I probably need to wait. So when there are multiple authentication methods selected, the STS needs to know like which authentication method to be used for authenticating the user, right? So I'll show you in a moment when the authentication methods are selected, let's say for federated identity, there is yet another directory is created called trust, and that would actually figure out which identity provider that the application needs to be redirected, user has to be redirected. Yes?
While we're waiting on that, I noticed there was other STSs listed up there.
Yep.
What were those?
So ADFS is the STS like that builds on top of WebIF that you can use for authenticating the user as identity provider. On the other hand, you can build your own custom STSs as well, or even like third-party STSs like SiteMinder. So these can be added in here as well. As that's how I'm able to get all the list of identity providers that this SharePoint installation trusts, and then you can able to select multiple identity providers there. Okay. Okay, is that done? Let me go back to my team side, which is already. All right. Probably need to clear the cookies here. Okay. All right, I guess the cookies are still there somehow. Windows Integrated Auth. So I'll probably wait for a minute before I come to the next one demo, then I'll show you again. Okay, let's basically the scenario would be what you would have seen is a login page where you can select which authentication method that the user you wanted to log in and then get access to the application. So what it does that boils down to is the trust. The application in SharePoint 2007 used to do everything by itself, all the authentication, right? All the authentication specific logics. But today with SharePoint 2010, it actually trusts the SharePoint STS and then being able to externalize all the authentication. Application worries only about claims, and it deals with the claims and performs necessary access control and other checks based on claims. Okay, so that's theme number one. Let's go to the next theme, which is on identity normalization. So this is, again, the claims are, the identity is normalized in SharePoint just based on claims. And both the SharePoint web applications and the service applications within the SharePoint, for example, search services or Excel services, they also are now available, claims are available for them as well, so that they can make decisions based on that. So one of the scenario that yesterday, like for SharePoint services scenario that was called out is, obviously intranet, you need to be able to show the pay stubs within your application. And then second of all, you are able to show any external data, external specific data within the SharePoint as well. And then most importantly, the identity delegation within the SharePoint is now possible. So within the cross-forms or even across the machines, you can use WIF's identity delegation feature. You get both user identity and the service identity available for you in the services as well. Like in SharePoint 2007, imagine you make a search query in your application. And what happens behind the scene is that search query sends back to the search service, and the search service will say, because it doesn't know who the user is, it will simply return back for all the results that are available for that particular query. And then the web front end will filter that query and figure out for this particular user, he is allowed to see these text only. With this automatic identity delegation, what you get is both user identity and service identity available for the search service, so that it will be able to filter out the data that is not needed for this particular or not authorized for this user, and send back the results that are needed only or authorized only for this user. Okay. So you can see that a lot of optimizations by just moving to this model, you are able to get that. And also, not only within SharePoint's shared services, you can have external services that are able to now talk to the SharePoint and display the content from the external services as well. So it was a nice session yesterday on business connectivity services. How many of you were there for that business connectivity services? So you can see how the business connectivity services opens up a wide gate for being able to talk to the external services, and now within the SharePoint itself, you can display the content for those. And most importantly, like for example, SAP services, they are SAML aware, and you are able to talk to those and get the data as well. And a quick primer, so all the services, like Excel Access services, they are built on top of Services Application Framework, which is claims aware, which is being WF enabled. And the way we got the claims is by using WF. And most importantly, the WF's WS Trust support is what enables all the services to be claims enabled. So as I said on the beginning, there are two sides of the coin. You have WS Federation, mainly for the ASP.NET passive cases, and then you have WS Trust, which is mainly for the services and the active cases. And again, on top of the WF is built on top of WCF, and then obviously the .NET framework, which is part of the .NET framework as well. So what it allows us is, with the application framework being made as claims aware, all the services that are built on top of that framework now can make use of claims. It's their choice. It doesn't have to be, but it's their choice. It's available for them. If they want, they can make use of those. Okay. So let's get a little bit deeper about how this identity delegation feature of WF is being used within the SharePoint. So here is a scenario with the form. In a form, I have a web part that is, can be inserted within the web app, and its web app wants to communicate with the backend service application. Let's say search service application. And the web part, the web application trusts the SharePoint SDS. Now, these are all inside the same form, so which means this search service application also trusts the tokens issued by the SharePoint SDS. Okay. Now, what the flow would be, the user accesses the web application, so he's already authenticated, right? At this level, I'm already authenticated. I am in my SharePoint web app, and I have my web part that talks to the search service. So I'm going to click that web part, and the web part, as it says here, the WS Trust, it has WS Trust proxy client within it. What it means is it knows in order to access this backend service, I need to go to this STS and get a token, and then present that token to this backend service. So that's available, that information is available within that WS Trust client, which is part of the WF as well. Okay. So the user, basically, the user token, the user is already authenticated, so he has a token. So he gives that token to the SharePoint SDS. The SDS looks at it and say, okay, you're trying to access this service, and you are accessing as the web publication. Okay, you have a process information as well. So it's going to return you, which is the leg 3, another token, which has both user and the process information, process identity as well. And I will actually show you the code, which is what you are more interested in seeing, how it's actually being done, what kind of APIs you actually call to actually make it work. And then this token T2, which is has both user identity and the process information, is getting forwarded to the search service application. Now, as I said, the application is built on top of Services Application Framework, which has the component called Gatekeeper, which we internally call Gatekeeper. You can think of it as a service authorization manager in WCF, right? So it retrieves the SAML token, and it identifies, okay, what are the claims available, which is already done for WF. So based on the claim, so do I have this form ID? Does it come from this particular process identity? So it does those authorization checks, and then allows the gatekeeper allows the service to take over. Now, the service on top of can make decisions on the user identity. So the gatekeeper does not do anything with the user identity claim. It basically looks at the process identity and specifically the form ID, and then it lets it go through. The service application can then do additional checks if he wants to, based on the user. And in this case, the search service is doing additional checks and then filters out the data that goes out of as the results. Okay? So that's the step number 5. That's action requirements. And then once the results comes back, then user is now able to see the results in its web part. So that's the 6-leg process that happens behind the scenes when you are having a web part that is connected to the shared service at the back end, and you basically click that web part. Okay? Let's go to another scenario where I have two forms. I have Form A and I have Form B within my enterprise. Okay? So we're going to change the slide a little bit here. So I have a Form A that has a web part and my STS. And then I have a Form B, that's where my search service is living now. And again, as I said, each form has an STS. So I have an STS here as well. So the applications and services a part of that form are able to, are trusting that particular STS. So in this case, now the interesting point is how the search service application is going to be using or accepting the token from the Form A, because right, it's two different forms. So in this case, what happens, there is a trust establishment process you would have to go through and say, search service in Form B, go ahead and start trusting the tokens that are issued by the STS in Form A. So the trust has been established now, so which means the service is ready to accept tokens from that particular Form A STS as well. So let's quickly go through the flow in this particular scenario. So I have user clicking the web part. Now the user is, now I know the web part is saying you need to talk to the service in the Form B, so go and get a token from the STS, and it presents the T1, the user token, and gets it back T2, which has user and the process information, and gives that the token to the services in Form B, which will then, the gatekeeper will figure out, okay, is the user, yes, I trust the SharePoint STS in Form A, so I'm going to accept the token, and then enumerate the claims out of that token as well. And then check the claims, yes, it's available, and let the user in. Okay? So that's in the cross-form scenario, what the flow is. Okay, let me go to the quick demo here. So, first of all, I'd like to show you, as you know, many of you know, there are several services around, maybe more than 20 services that are available in the SharePoint installation. And all those services are built on top of Services Application Framework. However, not all the services are actually using the claims model. For example, the search services is the major one that uses the claims right now. Based on that, it will filter out the data. But other services, for example, project services, they are not using directly the claims. They are using the claims, but not necessarily in the identity delegation feature way. So we need to create yet another, just give a process identity. Don't give them the user identity aspect. So you can be very specific about, depending on the services requirement, you can be able to choose to send just the user identity or both user and the process identity. So now here is the list of services that are available in SharePoint. And what I have done is I have created my own sample shared service. Now I was thinking of initially creating it on the stage, but it wasn't, I figured out it's not like going to be a 10-minute demo, so it's going to be a much more longer process. So I figured I'll just create one, and I'll show you how to, when I get access to it, so this sample apps, what the kind of results you get. It's a super mathematical application. So let's see. And before I go to the next screen, so the permissions, if you look at the, as I said, the secure shared services, you can permit based on the forms. If you remember, I said you can trust you can establish the trust with the STS and another form and all. So here is one place where you can specify what's the form ID is, and then enable that so that the service application says, now I'm ready to accept that particular form ID as well. Okay, that's where this is the form ID, so great that you can basically enter. This has come as a claim, as I noticed in the first demo. All right, let me go ahead and log in. Okay, so I have another app. Let me close all this now. Okay, and I'll show you what are the claims that are available when the user logged in. So I logged in as the Fabricam administrator user, which is going to be same as the number of claims that I showed you before. And then what happens when I'm trying to access that particular sample secure service? As the flow indicated, it basically, it's not going to show the exact cartoon saying, okay, here is what the flow will be. It's going to show, okay, now you have access to the service. But I will show you the actual code that actually was doing all this magic. Okay, so this is my claims issued, list of claims issued by the STS, and I have my form ID claim here. And let me go ahead and try to access my sample service applications. Now it started doing, this is the web part that I have included here. So it goes to the STS, presenting my user token, which is fabricom/administrator, and now getting back, gets back an ACTAS token, gives that back to the sample service. Sample service, okay, you're good to go. The framework, the gatekeeper says, yes, I accept the token, and then the application is now available for me. So it's a very simple application. I mean, the concept, the code that does all this magic is, let me show you right here. Here we go. So the key part that does the ACTAS dance is the call right here. So create channel as logged on user. So in WCF, whenever you want to access a backend service from the client, basically you create a WCF channel to be able to do it. Now that's a basic WCF channel. However, in the WIF enabled WCF, what you will be able to do is you will be able to specify, hey, create a channel acting as this particular user, and here is the token of the user. So WIF offers that feature, and in SharePoint, we actually made use of that feature, and we built another wrapper I said, service application framework, so that actually exposes this wrapper API. Now, what this create channel act as logon user does internally. So now, this is what I would do. This is not the actual SharePoint code, but this is what I kind of simulated exactly what happens in SharePoint too. So I would create, get the token for the existing user. So in my case, in the sample services case, I would have go to my iClaims principal and retrieve the bootstrap token off of that iClaims principal, and then use that token to make a call into create channel with issue token. So as you can see, this issue token is coming, this particular method is available in identitymodel.wstrust.channelFactory_operations, which is the WIF exposes the API. So after this, create channel with issue token, after this, all the heavy lifting about going to the STS, getting the token, and being able to present that to the backend service, all is done by WIF, right? So the SharePoint actually created just a framework around it. So that's the key component that actually, the key API that enables this particular feature, okay? So in the meantime, let me so now we saw a shared service, a sample shared service that's built on top of services application framework. Now we're able to show me the data within SharePoint. Now how cool it is if I can actually build a service that understands claims, right? Claims aware service, which is outside of my domain, outside of my shared services. It's not part of shared SharePoint. It's built outside of SharePoint. However, I will still be able to show the data within the SharePoint itself. Basically, I'm creating an external service, and then the external service trusts the SharePoint STS, and then it will accept the token that is issued by the STS, return the results to it. So let's do that. Let's create an external service. All right, so let's see. So the WIF has in the SDK package, which offers there are 4 major Visual Studio templates that are available. So ones that are showed here is claims-aware ASP.NET website, and then you have a claims-aware WCF service, WCF security token service, and then ASP.NET security token service. So these templates basically already did all the plumbing needed for a WCF service. So they are ready to go as a WIF-enabled services, okay? So I'm going to pick that template, and let me go ahead. Create a service. Okay, and let's look at the web.config for this service so that you can see how WIF is plugged in to the WCF channel. So one major aspect here is I'm using, again, there are 2 ways you can plug in the WIF into a WCF service. One is through the configuration, which is what I'm going to show you now. And then also through code, you can configure the WCF service host by calling like configure service host, Federation Credential Service configure service host, and then enable WIF as well. So in the behaviors, I have included a service behavior. It's called the service behavior extension called Federated Service Host Configuration. And that behavior extension is, as you can see, it actually enables or plugs in the WIF into the WCF's pipeline so that when there is an incoming token, it will be able to, it will go through the WIF's pipeline, and the WIF will do the verifications, necessary verifications, and then make the claims available for the service. Okay? So I have, again, these are already done for me. So, and all I have to do is use this template to start off with. So now I'm going to enable this particular service to trust the SharePoint STS. So for that, I need to add, let me go ahead and add the custom binding. To avoid typing time, I'm just going to use, okay. Now here, as you can see, the custom binding is actually pointing to my STS. This is the SharePoint STS's address, issuer address. Okay, so under this web application, and specifically under this STS folder, I have this WCF service. I mean, it's an STS as well, it's exposed. Then I have the issuer metadata for that service is available on this particular address as well, which has the information about what endpoints are available in this STS and so on. Let me add this service, this endpoint as my default endpoint. Okay, so the configuration I want is this name right there. Okay, so my endpoints is now configured with the custom binding. I'm going to remove the template specific code, which is not needed for this particular connecting to the SharePoint service. The next step I need to do is being able to, for the demo purposes, I'm going to turn off any revocation checks so that it doesn't go online and trying to do the stuff. All right. Okay, and the next step is making sure I have an identity model section. Okay, so now what I have done is basically created a link from this service to my STS. So that's what I have done so far. So I said this is WIF enabled service. So the WIF really expects, it understands the SAML token. So when the token comes in, it needs to validate whether it is indeed scoped for this service or not. So I need to specify what's the audience URI. That's what we say in the WS Trust spec is, what is this token scoped for? So that for that purposes, and to do any additional issuer checks if I wanted to do. So when the token comes in addition to the WIF specific checks, I want to do additional checks with the issuer. So before I accept claims that are available for this service. So to do that, I need to add a Microsoft Identity Model section. Okay, let me go ahead and add that. Okay. So now here I have an audience URI specified and an issuer name registry. This is where the actual checks you can do about who the issuer is, and if you trust that issuer, then you can let them in. So you can do additional checks in addition to what the WIF is doing. All right, and then let's go ahead and add config section. So I need to add this. I'll be able to create. Okay, and in addition to, so I have configured my app, the service, to be able to talk to the STS. So now I want to expose some methods within the service so that when somebody calls in, I can return back, let's say, customer's data, right? So I'm going to add in a couple of methods into the service. So let me go ahead. Okay, and let me make sure the operation contract. Okay, the implementation. Okay. All right. So what I have done is I have updated my config to trust the STS so that the service can accept the token from it. Then I have added in additional methods within the service so that when somebody calls in for get customers data, I can return the data. Okay. Let me go ahead and build it and then publish it to the site. Okay. Okay, so I have now published the site to the site now. Let me log into. I just want to make sure that able to get the data. Now, so there is a trust established from service to the STS. But the other direction, where the STS, when somebody comes in and asks for, hey, I want to go to this service, give me a token. The STS just can't, it has to know that, yes, this is indeed the service that I trust, so I can give you a token. So that process, I have used the BCS to declaratively enable that service within the SharePoint. So the SharePoint now is aware of this service that I just created. So that's why I published it to the specific location. So that portion, I'm assuming the BCS section is already covered, how you actually configure the BCS to declaratively register with the service. So let me go ahead now here and so while it's trying to access the external content type, so how many of you actually are WCF service developers, like who create SAML-aware, claims-aware WCF developers? So a couple of them, okay. So with this model, with this new SharePoint 2010 model of SAML-aware services, now you will be able to create all the services just based on claims, and then now plug in the data within this. And here you go. It's now able to get all the data from my external service that I just built, and then able to show within the SharePoint application itself. Make sense? Wasn't cool? Yeah? So that's for the externalizing. So you can see how powerful it is now to be able to just return a SAML, having a SAML-specific, SAML-aware services, and then being able to show the data within SharePoint itself. Now, let me go to the next section, next theme, which is non-claims-aware services. So in this case, this is about supporting existing infrastructure. So in reality, as I said earlier, all the claims-aware, not all the services are claims-aware. So there are, for example, even SharePoint uses the SQL database, which is not claims-aware yet. So in order to get access to those services to retrieve the data, what I need to be able to do is somehow rehydrate. So I log in as Windows authenticated user and then get the claims-based identity. Before I get access to go and access the SQL, I want to be able to rehydrate the Windows identity. So the solution is, so WIF has a service called Claims to Windows Token Service. So what this does is, it's a Windows service that's get installed as part of WIF when you install it. It is not enabled by default. So you need to go explicitly enable it, meaning make it active and then start the service. And also, it's not for everybody just can use the service. You need to explicitly say who the user groups are that can access this service. Okay? And it basically uses an S4U login. If you pass in the UPN claim, it will be able to use the S4U login and get the Windows identity for that. Okay? Now, let me quickly show you how this is used within the SharePoint itself. Okay, so for this, I'm going to log into a client box now. So as an end user, I log into my SharePoint application, and now I see there are a bunch of Excel spreadsheets that are uploaded and the shared documents. So let me go ahead and try to open one of the Excel sheet. So I'm going to try to open this within the browser itself. Now what happens here is The web front end goes to the backend service, the Excel service for saying, give me this particular data that the user is requesting. Then the Excel shared service will go to the SQL. This is where the spreadsheet itself is actually getting data out of the SQL itself. Okay? So the Excel will then go and try to talk to the SQL databases, the specific table, and then try to retrieve the data. So since I have already logged in, there are going to be some cached entries here. But the challenge is when you go directly from Excel, it will go directly and talk to the SQL and get the data. But when you go through SharePoint application, it has to go to that multiple hop and then get the actual data. So what I see here is 2 entries available. So Adam Carter and Shesha Manning. That's the year of birth, by the way, if you believe me. Let me go back to my SharePoint 14 server. And I'm going to load up the SQL server here itself. Let me close out all the remaining. So I'll show you exactly what data is available within the SQL server so that you can see whatever is available showed me in this user database is really a cached database. However, when I try to refresh it, what happens? Go ahead, load it. Okay, databases, tables. Okay, so I have a bunch of other data here as well, right? 3 or almost 4 or 5 entries altogether here. And let me go back to the client machine. And as a normal user, I'm trying to go to refresh all the connections. Okay, this is timed out, so I'm going to try to I guess it's probably going to say timeout. Here we go. So what it tells me is the error is saying I'm trying to refresh your data by talking to the backend SQL service, but I'm not able to get the credential that I need to get to the talk to the SQL service. That's basically the error that is coming from the Excel shared service then propagated to the web front-end application. So why this has happened? Because there is nothing like the service that I talked about, the claims to Windows token service. So let's make sure that is up and running, and it is configured with the specific group that is allowed to talk to that service. So as you can see, the service has not started yet. So that's one of the reasons why it's not letting me get through, because there is nobody in the middle who's doing the rehydration of that Windows identity. And as I said, within that claims identity, I have this configuring the service. Let me go back to, okay, samples. Okay, so as you can see, this is a simple config file where you can specify which users are allowed to access this service. Okay. Now here for SharePoint, we have added a group called WSS WPG, which allows users belong to that group can access this particular service. Once I configured it, now the service is up and running. And let me go back to the client and now try to refresh the data. Here we go. So now the data is available. Okay. So you can see how smoothly, like multiple hops, you had claim space identity. The last hop, you don't have the Windows identity. Now you're able to, once you have the service enabled and you configured it, you are able to retrieve the data. Now the make a call into the service is basically one API call. Like you call into UPN, what we call create UPN login, and then you pass in the UPN claim, which is available as a claim for you. Okay. Now let me go back to the prime point now. All right. So 3 themes that we talked about today: externalizing authentication, identity normalization, which is service-oriented, and the third one is supporting the existing infrastructure, which is basically I'm looking at how do you convert from claims-based identity to the Windows identity. And let me go through quickly the lessons learned. Very first question we asked ourselves is 2 years back, right? Where do we start? We have this gigantic SharePoint application, which is built for 15 years of code. Where do we really start this application? I'm sure you will have the exact same question as well when you start doing the claims-based identity. The answer is there are multiple paths that you can start talking, so that is starting the point, right? So the starting point, there are multiple to get into this identity, to convert it to a claims-based identity. But it's not about all or nothing deal. It's not like you have to transfer everything to claims-based or you can't do nothing. That's not the case here. You can do in phases. So for example, we took the services framework. That's the first thing we started with, because that's the foundation for all the services. So we enabled that with services first with the WIF, and then the sign-in methods that are available. So we introduced that in the claims-based model as well. Our goal was to be able to do this claims-based in one shot for this release. That's why we took all these changes at one shot. However, for your applications, you may choose to do it in phases and then release them accordingly. Because even though this iClaims principle is the extended version of iPrinciple and it is something you wanted to use, it will still work with your existing app. Because whatever your app is returned to, let's say iIdentity.isAuthenticator or whatever the current properties you are using, those will continue to work. So you can enable your app, just claims identity, and it will just continue to work. When you choose to use the claims, you can move to specifically start using the claims itself. That's the big learning that we had from this particular integration. The second major one that I want to call out is performance. I know many of the folks that in the previous sessions have asked, what is the performance for this particular? It looks like a lot of round trips happening and what. So the very first thing I want to call out, we actually did when we started the performance milestone, we were like 10 times higher than our performance goal, right? Because we just said, let's make it work first. Then we got it work, and then when we started the performance milestone, we said, all right, let's figure out and focus on performance. And a couple of things we really optimized. The first thing is number of claims that are getting inside the token. So if you choose to, let's say, in a typical user, in a typical enterprise domain users, for example, in Microsoft, we have users who have like 200, 300 groups that they belong to, and they come in, right? So you determine how many number of claims you really care for your services. For example, the backend service that I mentioned that actually has the gatekeeper and does the service authorization, it doesn't need all the group sets. It really cares about that form ID and the primary sales, and based on that, it will be able to make the decision on it. So just be very cautious about what are the claims you really need for your application, and choose to emit only those claims. Second one is about how many service calls you are making per page, right? So today you might be making like say 90 or 80 calls per SharePoint page because you have a lot of different services you want to go through and do it. Instead, you may want to optimize the number of calls you are making so that you can avoid the round trips that happens. The third major one is the round trip that goes directly to the STS itself. So the tokens that are getting issued by the STS, they have a valid expiration period. So they are valid for, let's say, 10 hours. You can choose to set that value as well. So in your environment, you don't have to go for every service call to the STS and get a token. You can cache them. That's just what I'm calling out as caching the tokens, and then use that for this specific product time. And then last one is number of, as I said, caching is another one. The other major lessons was edge cases and the assumptions. So again, when you put out the cookie that comes out of this mode, make sure that you are able to, it's enough size, it meets the cookie size limitations, like 16K, I believe is the cookie size limitation. And you may choose to say, well, we're going to send out only the reference to the cookie, not necessarily the whole cookie itself. So that's what we did in the SharePoint itself. We actually need only the reference to it. And the last one I want to call out is the client integration. What are the clients that you are targeting? So in SharePoint, we have browser client, active clients, and SharePoint Designer tool clients. So we need to be able to do every client types. So in your case, you may choose, based on those client types, you may have to have both base passive and active endpoints. So those are all the lessons we learned. And with that, the summary is we achieved a new path to the identity in SharePoint 2010. And key takeaway is, as you see, the multiple hops is a single model now. It's all claims-based. And more importantly, it is standards-based and interoperable as well. And we have stepped up this challenge and make those happen. Again, the same thing, not only for SharePoint, will be useful for your applications as well. With that, I'll thank you. And I know we ran into a little bit more for 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, please come and ask me. Thank you.